The man after whom the museum at the tip of Museum Island is named, Wilhelm von Bode, is arguably the most important individual in the history of the Berlin museums, for which he worked for nearly 50 years. He joined the sculpture department as an assistant in 1872 and rose through the ranks to become Director General in 1905, a position he held until 1920. From Chicago to St. Petersburg, his name was synonymous with the Berlin museums. He worked relentlessly to enhance them by acquiring works of art, by opening new areas of collecting, and developing a novel presentation mode that combined objects in various media. He added 2 buildings to Museum Island, the Bode Museum, originally the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, which opened in 1904, and the Pergamon Museum, which was planned as early as 1905 but opened only in 1930, 1 year after Bode's death. Friedrich Winkler wrote of Bode that, quote, outside Germany, his achievements influenced first and foremost American museums, end quote. Bode's complex relationship with America cannot be reduced to a single denominator. In my presentation, I will focus on 2 issues that provide insight into this give and take. First, Bode's contact with American collectors, here represented by John Pierpont Morgan, and second, the gradual adoption of Bode's method of presentation in American museums. When Bode started his career in 1872, the Royal Prussian museums were substantial, but they did not measure up to the much older dynastic collections in Vienna, Munich, or Paris. At his retirement in 1920, the Berlin holdings had grown so much that they were the equal of these collections, and in certain areas far surpassed them. Bode systematically acquired early Netherlandish painting, here as an example Hugo van der Roos, pictures by Albrecht Dürer, works by Rembrandt and Frans Hals, here Male Babbe, Italian paintings, here Pollaiuolo from the 14th to the 18th century, Italian Renaissance sculpture, here Donatello, and German sculpture, here Riemenschneider. A key to Bode's successful acquisitions was his connoisseurship in many different areas, which he had built by studying original works of art in almost all the museums of Europe and North America. Bode also secured for Berlin the talents of such gifted art historians as Max Friedländer, here in the middle, who joined the Gemäldegalerie in 1896. Equally important was the will of the Imperial House to establish its legitimacy by fostering the arts in the capital of its new empire. Nowhere in Berlin were so many masterpieces acquired in so few years as in Imperial Berlin. The only place with a comparable collecting activity, quantitatively and qualitatively, was the United States. And here the Metropolitan Museum around 1910. The growth of American museums, first on the East Coast and somewhat later in the Midwest, coincided with Bode's tenure in Berlin. The oldest museum in the United States, the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, opened in 1842. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York were both founded in 1870. This is the first building of the Metropolitan Museum in Central Park, around 1875. The Philadelphia Museum of Art was founded in 1875 and the Detroit Institute of Art in 1887. Unlike German museums, which were funded principally by the state, American museums were financed and administered by trustees drawn from the highest levels of local society. Many of them, here J.P. Morgan again, many of them had built their wealth in finance, railways, commerce, industry, and oil. Starting in the early 1870s, after the end of the American Civil War, they traveled regularly to Europe, where they visited churches, palaces, and museums. They developed a taste for old masters and ancient art, for which they were willing to pay top prices. This soon benefited museums at home. In 1889-1890, the Metropolitan Museum received from its trustee Henry Marquand major paintings by Filippo Lippi, Petrus Christus, Frans Hals, and Van Dyck, as well as Vermeer's Lady with a Ewer, to this day one of the most beloved works in the museum. Throughout his career, Bode kept abreast of American art collecting and reported about it in both Germany and the United States. He obtained his information from dealers from whom he authenticated paintings and sculptures, as well as collectors such as the Philadelphia lawyer John G. Johnson. Bode traveled to the United States in 1893 and in 1911, at which time he visited every museum and private collection between the East Coast and Chicago. This is J.P. Morgan again. His balancing act in the debate around the quote-unquote danger posed by American collectors for Europe demonstrates his ability to make the best of a difficult situation for him and the Berlin museums. The astronomical prices being paid by Americans made headlines in Europe, and Bode was criticized for not doing enough to secure masterpieces in Berlin. It's interesting to note that the first laws safeguarding patrimony in Europe, both in France and in Italy, were passed just before the First World War as a reaction not only on the collecting practices of the Americans, but in Italy on the collecting practices of Bode. And here, again, Morgan with one of his Rembrandts. Bode, aptly nicknamed Museum Bismarck, actively sought out American collectors. He received them in Berlin and toured them through the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. He called on them when he visited the United States, and he kept a lively correspondence with some of the most eminent among them. As Bode well knew, no scholarship comparable to his of Friedlander's took place in American museums in the early decades of their existence. The exception perhaps being the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, also here in an early incarnation, which had close ties to Harvard University. Bode thus wrote in 1902 that despite the unequal financial competition from America, the expertise of European museums was and would remain for years unmatched on the other side of the Atlantic. As a proof of that, Americans often consulted Bode or his publications before acquiring works of art. The New York collector Benjamin Altman, for instance, certainly used Bode's catalog of the Rodolphe Kahn collection in Paris before buying in 1908 the 9 most important Dutch paintings in it, including Vermeer's Sleeping Maid, now in the Metropolitan Museum. Bode had advised Kahn in Paris in the hope that his collection would come to Berlin. Given those circumstances, it is all the more surprising that Bode made American collectors aware of works on the market, some of which would have considerably enhanced the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. In 1912, Bode recommended to Altman the acquisition of the Holy Family by Mantegna, then in the Weber collection in Hamburg. Bode could give up this picture, which is considerably abraded, since Berlin already had 3 stellar Mantegnas. It is perhaps less easy to understand why in 1906 Bode encouraged Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston to buy from a Florentine dealer a detached fresco with a life-size representation of Hercules by Piero La Francesca, an artist not represented in Berlin at the time. The St. Jerome on the left was acquired much later. Did Bode think that winning the favors of American collectors would eventually be a greater gain for the Berlin museums than acquiring the works themselves? Gardner's collection was shaped principally by Bode's arch-rival Bernard Berenson. Could this rivalry have played a role in these recommendations? These must remain speculations. It is clear, however, that Bode expected something in return, but neither Altman nor Gardner made any significant gifts to the Berlin museums. Bode was more successful with John Pierpont Morgan, whom he advised to buy Andrea Bregno's St. Andrew, a refined sculpture made for the old St. Peter's, now in the Metropolitan Museum. In 1907, Morgan asked Bode to write the catalogue of his collection of small bronzes. In gratitude, the financier presented the Kaiser Friedrich Museum with Fra Angelico's superb Death of St. Francis, the central panel of a predella whose lateral scenes were already in Berlin. Bode had found the picture at Durlacher's in London and selected it himself as Morgan's gift to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. Bode's acquaintance with Morgan, whom he had met in Berlin in 1902 and with whom he corresponded until the latter's death in 1913, proved of capital importance for the development of American museums. Born in 1837 as the son of a Connecticut banker, Morgan was schooled in Vevey in Switzerland and in Göttingen in Germany, and was thus fluent in French and German. He traveled often in Europe and had residences in Paris and London. His consolidation of banks and railway companies, which earned him the nickname Railway Bismarck, made him one of the wealthiest and most influential men of his time. A voracious collector, he spent 30 times as much on art yearly as all the Berlin museums combined, as Bode lamented to the New York Times in 1912. With Bode, you have to take everything he says with a grain of salt, because he was very keen, very adept at making his statements fit the purpose of the times. Morgan is the only figure, and I remember Museum Bismarck and Railway Bismarck. Morgan is the only figure in the history of American museums whose influence can be compared to Bode's. Morgan had been a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum since 1888 and its president from 1905 until 1913. Like Bode, he exuded self-confidence, a conviction that what he did was right. The museums that Bode and Morgan oversaw were the premier cultural institutions in metropolises whose populations both grew threefold between 1870 and 1914. In the 8 years of Morgan's presidency, he doubled the size of the Metropolitan Museum by added several wings. Like Bode in Berlin, Morgan opened the Met to new areas of collecting and arranged for the museums to carry out excavations in Egypt and the Middle East. Before I go to the next slides, this is the Metropolitan, at the top is the Metropolitan Museum as Morgan found it, and at the bottom is as he left it. So Morgan opened the Met to new areas of collecting and arranged for the museum to carry out excavations in Egypt and the Middle East. On the right, you see Morgan visiting the Valley of the Kings, which laid the basis for its archaeological collections. Morgan saw to it that the Met acquired important examples of Greek art, a hitherto neglected area. Like Bode, Morgan hired talented scholars such as Edward Robinson, the former director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and an archaeologist trained in Germany, who contributed greatly to the professionalism of museum practice at the Met. Morgan advocated an aggressive acquisition policy. Under his leadership, the museum would no longer buy plaster casts, but original masterpieces, and all of the ones on the screen were bought during his tenure as president of the Metropolitan Museum. For this purpose, he drew the richest men in New York to the board of the Metropolitan Museum. The opening of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in 1904 received critical acclaim in the United States. The Metropolitan's annual report of 1905 praises Bode's museum as, quote, a model installation that balances the aesthetic and the scientific, end quote. The Kaiser Friedrich Museum was also admired in America because it proved that a first-rate collection could still be assembled. As Thomas Gaetgens has argued, it is unfair to characterize Bode first and foremost as a connoisseur. That he was certainly, but Bode also considered himself a cultural historian, a student of Jakob Burckhardt, whose Cicerone he updated in several editions with the author's blessing. Bode himself described his installations as painterly, as malerisch, as aesthetically pleasing, but, like Burckhardt, he placed works of art in the broader context of cultural history. Despite the conservatism ascribed to Bode, he was one of the earliest art historians to conceive his museum installations, above all from the point of view of art mediation, given greater weight to their effect on visitors than to the opinion of colleagues. A photograph of the Florentine Quattrocento cabinet at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum perfectly illustrates Bode's method. The arrangement is strictly symmetrical. In the middle of each wall is the most important work of art. On the left wall hangs Filippo Lippi's fabled Adoration of the Child from Palazzo Medici. On the middle wall is Fra Angelico's triptych with the Last Judgment. A cassone stands under each painting, denoting its prayers of pride. The Lippi is flanked by the bust of a princess of Urbino, then ascribed to Desiderio da Settignano. In the room was also a bust of John the Baptist, which Bode considered a work by Donatello, as he did the relief with the flagellation visible in the picture. This work is now in Moscow in the Pushkin Museum. Donatello's Pazzi Madonna was also hung in this gallery, as did Masaccio's Tondo with a birth scene. The installation thus combined the works of painters and sculptors of one city and one era. Bode commented in the museum guide that Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi were indebted to Masaccio, that Donatello and Masaccio were contemporaries, and that in Quattrocento Florence, the sacred and the profane were not strictly separated domains. The superb bust, Desiderio da Settignano's portrait of Maria Strozzi, was also in this space. A likeness is of the Italian aristocracy who commissioned those works and whose status is hinted at by the heraldic reliefs above. So you have a heraldic relief above a bust. In short, Bode's presentation achieved three goals. First, it combined works in different media and articulated stylistic relationships among them. Second, the symmetry ensured a pleasing or painterly impression while maintaining a hierarchy of presentation. And third, the installation conveyed elements of the historical and cultural context in which the works of art were created. After acquiring the Parisian Hunchel collection, we are now in New York, J.P. Morgan decided to exhibit it in the Metropolitan Museum according to Bode's concept. The collection consisted of French medieval sculpture, here a major piece, a 12th century Virgin from Auvergne, as well as 18th century furniture. Morgan wanted it to make the core of a future department of decorative arts and commissioned a new wing for it. It is now the wing in which arms and armor are displayed. This is where arms and armor are displayed. In 1907, the financier asked Bode to recommend a qualified scholar for the presentation of the Hunchel collection. Bode nominated Wilhelm Valentiner, here seated with his brother. With Valentiner's appointment as curator of decorative arts in 1908, Bode's mode of presentation took root in America. Wilhelm Valentiner was born in Karlsruhe in 1880. A student of Henry Tordes in Heidelberg, he wrote his dissertation on Rembrandt's drawings under Cornelis Hofstede de Groot. From 1905 to 1907, Valentiner was Bode's assistant in the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, and he worked with Julius Lessing at the Kunstgewerbe Museum as well, as in the Department for Islamic Art. Photographs of Valentiner's installation of the Hunchel collection in the new wing of the Metropolitan Museum show that he applied Bode's method faithfully. He combined works in various media from the same era, and he arranged the objects as symmetrically as possible. The most important works of art were in the middle, where, following Bode's example, they were emphasized by a credenza or another piece of furniture. In 1914, Valentiner returned to Germany and served in World War I. In 1919, following Germany's defeat and the abdication of the Kaiser, he published a manifesto titled Restructuring Museums in the Spirit of a New Age, which was met with general rejection. In it, Valentiner defended Bode's mode of presentation, which had come under heavy criticism from the avant-garde, who favored the neutral, quote-unquote, studio presentation, in German Atelierraum Simulation. Valentiner made himself particularly unpopular among his fellow curators when he suggested the creation of a quote-unquote central museum of masterpieces to be built somewhere in the middle of Germany, and to which each museum in the country would contribute a few key works. For instance, the Städel Institute in Frankfurt would have to give up Van Eyck's Lucca Madonna. The Gemäldegalerie in Berlin and the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden were all to contribute their Van Eycks. Valentino was called a Bolshevik. Sensing that he had no future in Germany, Valentino returned to America in 1921. Bode, probably grateful for Valentino's loyalty, saw to it that he received an invitation to write the catalogue of the Widener collection in Philadelphia, now one of the core collections of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In late 1921, Valentino was called to Detroit, where he worked first as a consultant and then was named director of the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1924. Valentino oversaw the installation of the collections in the museum's new building on Woodward Avenue, and which we see here on the screen, and emulating Bode's Kaiser Friedrich Museum, he combined different media systematically. He remained director in Detroit, which he built into one of America's preeminent cultural institutions until 1945, and here the Bruegel he acquired for Detroit. Valentino, who afterward held positions at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Getty Museum, and the North Carolina Museum of Art, exerted a considerable influence on American museums, in particular those in Philadelphia, in Boston, and Cleveland, which followed his example and installed their collections chronologically, combining works in all media. In Germany, World War I brought Bode's plans for the expansion of Museum Island, in particular the construction of the Pergamon Museum, to a halt. For you to know, the Bode Museum, the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, was from the start too small for the collection. Bode planned the expansion into the Pergamon Museum not only for the archaeological collection, but this wing, the north wing, was to house the collections of Northern European art. It was the Deutsches Museum for 1930 when it opened until 1939 when it closed down at the start of World War II. After the revolution of 1918, strong criticism was voiced against Bode's presentation concept, which was seen as a vehicle of imperial self-representation. In an essay titled Der Berliner Museumskrieg, Berlin Art War, the art critic Karl Scheffler wrote that a quote-unquote historically correct environment only harms beautiful works of art, and an evocative presentation does not enhance them either. The best is a neutral presentation, end quote. The new objectivity triumphed in the Kaiser Friedrich Museum as well. Max Friedländer, the director of the Gemäldegalerie, was forced out of office by the National Socialists on 29 June 1933 and was succeeded by Karl Kötschau, who reinstalled the Italian collections, separating paintings and sculpture. I want to be perfectly clear that I'm not equating a separate presentation of painting and sculpture with Nazism, but in Germany it happened in 1933 after Friedländer, because he was a Jew, was forced out of office. In America, by contrast, Bode remained a model. In 1929, during the construction of the new Philadelphia Museum of Art, its director, Fiske Kimball, wrote, "In the Museum of the Future, the aim will be to place the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, extended to cover the whole history of art, above the Victorian Albert. In other words, contemplation should occur on the bel étage, which houses masterpieces in all media, together in a painterly fashion, while on the ground floor, the holdings of lesser importance should be displayed according to techniques and materials strictly separated to facilitate the study of art." A century after the inauguration of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, Bode's legacy in American museums endures, even if his influence is seldom acknowledged. These institutions display paintings and sculptures that he once coveted for Berlin, or that he advised American collectors to acquire. The professionalization of museum work in the United States in the early decades of the 20th century, which laid the foundations for the future, owes much to the example he set in Berlin. Finally, after being separated for years, paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts are reunited in renovated galleries in several American museums, for example, Philadelphia, or in here, Cleveland and Boston, but also the Metropolitan Museum, where since the new reinstallation of the European paintings collections, you have examples of sculpture in the painting galleries. And this is following a mode of presentation developed by Bode. And now, in Berlin, coming full circle, works in different media are once again exhibited side by side, and they can be seen in the museum that bears Bode's names. Thank you very much.